First of all, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. We really hope you find this short presentation helpful, informative and challenging. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end if we have enough time. And just to say that we are recording this session. If that's a problem for you, you can switch off your video down on the left at the bottom of your screen if you're on a laptop, or by some other means if you're on a phone. Also, if you could mute yourselves if you're not already muted, again, you can do that somewhere on your screen. And if not, I'll ask Toby to have a look around and mute you. Let's get started. And I'm going to share my screen now. So I'm going to spend 5 minutes offering a vision for a transformed future if we do what is required to address the looming catastrophe of climate change. And a lot is required. The IPCC has said we need rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. If we don't act now, within the next few years, we're in great danger of losing our ability to address climate change at all and allowing the world to tailspin into a really frightening future. So I'm going to read in just a second from a book called The Future We Choose by Cristina Figueres, who is the former United Nations Executive Secretary for Climate Change. And this section imagines what our world might look like in 2050 if we do what we need to do now, starting right now. So, the world in 2050, if we do what we need to do. We have been successful in halving emissions every decade since 2020. And we're heading for a world that will be no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer by 2100. In most places in the world, the air is moist and fresh, even in cities. The air is cleaner than it has been since before the Industrial Revolution. And we have trees to thank for that. They are everywhere. Corporate donations and public money has funded the biggest tree planting campaign in history. The trees took carbon dioxide out of the air and put it back where it belongs, in the soil. This helped to diminish climate change, but the benefits were even greater. On every sensory level, the feeling of living on what has again become a green planet has been transformative, especially in cities. And in this imaginary look at the future, cities have never been better places to live. With many more trees and far fewer cars, it has been possible to reclaim whole streets for urban agriculture and children's play. Every vacant plot has been repurposed and turned into a shady grove. Every rooftop has been converted into a garden. And she goes on to talk about other changes that have been made by 2050. Industrial agriculture has changed and no one seems to miss it. Now we have nut and fruit orchards, woodland interspersed with grazing, parkland areas that spread for miles, new havens for regenerated populations of bees and insects. New rail networks have largely replaced air travel. Petrol and diesel vehicles are now only seen in museums. Electric vehicles are everywhere, but they're needed less because public transport is affordable for all. We no longer burn fossil fuels. Most of our energy comes from renewable sources. All homes and buildings produce their own electricity, and energy is basically free. The transition to regenerative farming practices has revolutionized food production. The plant-based replacements for meat and dairy are so good that most of us don't notice their absence. Food is also universally grown in local communities and individual gardens, and all of these major changes have created millions of employment opportunities. And she continues that we are also, in 2050, even if we do what we need to do, still dealing with the effects of climate change from historic emissions. Glaciers and Arctic ice are still melting. Sea levels are still rising. Droughts and desertification have continued to increase, and the refugee problem has continued to worsen. But improving international cooperation has helped to address these problems. It's now recognized that it's in the interests of every country to bring all its resources to bear on problems across the world. Finding the solution to another country's problem may well benefit your country in a few years' time. Extricating ourselves from self-destruction would have been impossible if we hadn't changed, if we hadn't realized that doing what is good for humanity goes hand in hand with doing what is good for the earth. And the most fundamental change that we made was that collectively, as citizens, corporations, and governments, we began adhering to a new bottom line: is it good for humanity? Rather than, is it profitable? Now, I'm aware that all of this sounds like a fantasy, totally implausible, and clearly it's only a work of imagination. And perhaps as you were listening, a whole loads of buts were arising in your mind. And this is really not surprising given what our world currently looks like. But to a large degree, what this reflects is how our imaginations have been captured and impoverished. We find it really difficult to imagine anything different to what we have now. But our imaginations can, if we let them, propel us towards a better future. So now we're going to go on to look at this in more detail, and I'm going to hand on to Joe, who's going to talk to us about transport.
Okay, thank you very much, John, and welcome everyone. So I'm going to be pedaling furiously through my 5 minutes. I'm just going to time myself now. And I'm going to just give you a tiny bit of background about transport. And then I'm just going to look very briefly at the effects really of the pandemic on cities around the world. Then I'm going to go on to what's needed from governmental levels, and then what we can do personally. So the little tiny bit of background rather surprised me that transport remains the largest source of pollution at 28% of global emissions. And 55% of these emissions are actually from cars. Okay. Now I'm just going to go on to show you some interesting pictures really that were taken during the pandemic. And the background to these pictures is, during the pandemic, daily global carbon dioxide emissions fell by 17%, which is the single largest emission drop in recorded history. So how about that? CO2 emissions in European cities reduced by up to 75%. And in London, it was 59% reduction in CO2 emissions, with again, fewer car journeys being the main cause. Also, nitrogen dioxide air pollution levels dropped by about an average of 60% in most cities. So I'm now just going to show you the kind of on the ground, whoops, hang on, just need to share my screen. What could go wrong? Okie dokie. Yeah, okay, so I'm just going to show you some photos of before and after. Okay, so this is Milan before the pandemic, and this is Milan after the pandemic, during the pandemic, rather. This is Venice before, this is Venice afterwards. Just going to go to my favorite, which is, this is Delhi before, and this is Delhi, New Delhi afterwards. Okay, and just one more random, what have we got here? Yeah, okay, so this is Delhi again, before and afterwards, okay? So, yeah, just a little heads up on what things could look like. So in London, just what's happening around the globe now, rather around cities, in cities around the globe, as a result of the pandemic. In London, large areas are closed now to cars and vans, and people are allowed to walk and cycle safely. The main streets, for example, between London Bridge and Shoreditch, Euston and Waterloo, Old Street and Holborn, will be limited to buses, pedestrians and cars. And in the City of London, a newly publicised transport strategy focuses on sustainability with support for pedestrians and cyclists in the square mile. The Scottish government has announced £10 million to help create pop-up walking and cycling routes. Milan, the city of Milan, has announced 22 miles of streets to be transformed into cycleways. New York has unveiled plans to open 100 miles of streets for what it calls socially responsible recreation. Barcelona is adding 30,000 square meters to its pedestrian networks, 13 miles to the biking network. Mexico City is planning 80 miles of temporary bike lanes. So I could go on. So this is the attempt by local authorities and cities to sustain the benefits of the lockdown. So what do we need? What do we need to ensure that we move into a better future? Well, there's a recent Greenpeace report, what I'm mainly going to draw on for this. They say what we need is to speed up the transition to electric vehicles, and that'll create thousands of new jobs. We need to ban the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 2030. The government has recently announced a £250 million emergency active travel fund as the first stage of a £2 billion investment in walking and cycling, which is a good way forward, but Greenpeace calculate we need at least £6 billion over the next 5 years to fundamentally redesign transport to prioritise walking, cycling and improving public health and delivering clean air. And this £2 billion investment by the government, which sounds fairly impressive, needs to be seen against this £27 billion they've earmarked for road building. So we need to cancel this. And in fact, even the AA are in favour of cancelling that £27 billion investment and funneling it instead towards public transport and active travel and broadband investments. Public transport needs to be increased and is particularly has an impact on people with lower incomes. So sustainable and affordable public transport options for all are a foundation of levelling up communities across the country. We need to be adjusting speed limits to reduce them to 20 miles an hour, funding the purchase of support for the purchase of e-bikes, and increasing fuel duty over the next decade. We need to introduce a frequent flyer levy, which would reduce demand and is particularly targeted on frequent flyers. So there's a kind of free first fly, and then after that you are progressively taxed. So what can we do as individuals? Well, the most effective way actually to reduce transport emissions is, not surprisingly, to cycle or walk. It might be worth knowing that 66% of journeys are under 5 miles and 20% of journeys in Britain are under 1 mile. You can also respond to a government survey which is called Widen My Path, which allows people to suggest cycle paths and pedestrianisation and traffic flow changes in their area, and I'll put that up on the chat, the link to that, if you'd like to respond to that. And then the biggest thing really you can do is reduce or stop flying. Flying is by far the most polluting form of travel. One transatlantic flight generates more carbon dioxide than a resident of India will produce in an entire year. And of course, the next thing, of course, you can do is join a group like this one, or Friends of the Earth, or whoever else meets your needs and your agenda. Okay, thank you very much indeed.
I think that Joe, you're handing over to Nick now.
Yeah, Nick, sorry.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks ever so much for joining us. I'm going to go straight to screen share, if you don't mind. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Can everybody see that? Is anybody
Yes.
off mute? Is that working?
Yep, it's working.
Yes.
Yep.
Yep.
Right, so I'm Nick Cox. I'm talking to you about energy and buildings. This is a 1-hour presentation that I've condensed down to 10 minutes, so please bear with me. This graph shows the energy used to produce our electricity. The green line shows fossil fuels declining nicely from 2012 to 2020, and the red line shows renewables rising nicely. So we've pretty much produced parity between the two. Now, if only we'd have started this process 20 years earlier, that might be sufficient, but it isn't. And as we drill down into the actual fuel mix for last year, you'll see that in actual fact, renewables only made 33% of our power compared to say 41 for gas. So it wasn't as good as the first graph suggested, but it's a step in the right direction. And for a bit of good news, on the best day last year, on the 3rd of June, 55% of our energy consumption came from renewable energy, and fossil fuels only provided 17.5%. So we can do it. We just need to do it 365 days a year, not just one. The first problem we're facing is that as we, somebody's joining us. As we decarbonise transport and buildings, demand for electricity is going to absolutely skyrocket. This graph shows how demand is likely to rise by 2050. And if we do decarbonise transport and buildings, the graph will follow the upper line of that band, definitely not the lower bound. And of course, there is the elephant in the room. All of our nuclear power stations but one will have to be closed down very soon because they're obsolete. They're already running well beyond their design life. We have one new nuclear power station under production, under construction, and that's Hinkley Point C down in Somerset. It's entirely reliant on Chinese technology as well as Chinese money. And if we don't end our dispute with China very soon, that power station will never be finished. So we have a choice between a nuclear renaissance or a nuclear phase down. It would appear that we're going to have a nuclear phase down whether we like it or not. And actually, that's fine by me. I'd prefer to manage without nuclear power. Thank you very much. So how are we going to do it? I've identified 8 technologies which could make up this shortfall in power demand. The first 3, wind, solar, and hydroelectric, I haven't got time to talk about tonight. And in any case, these are now mature technologies. And until we get a means of storing electricity, the scope for increasing those 3 is very limited indeed. So moving to what we can do, I think the most exciting one of all is anaerobic digestion, because it takes waste that we're already producing, manure, food waste, biosolids, agricultural waste, human sewage as well, and it recycles and reuses this material. So it's a perfect example of the circular economy that we're campaigning for. You put this material in an anaerobic digester and it's fermented to produce biogas in the form of methane. We can use that to generate electricity, we can use it to produce heat, we can use it as fuel for our vehicles, and we can even put it into the gas grid. Now, most of the energy out of an anaerobic digester is in fact heat, but nevertheless, we could produce about 1 terawatt of electricity from anaerobic digesters, and we could bring online about 100 megawatts per annum for 10 years. That is a really good start. That is a step in the right direction. Perhaps the simplest of all is biomass combined with combined heat and power. Now, my only reservation with this one is that it takes agricultural land away from food production and uses it for energy production. But that's better than taking the land out of production for housing, and this process is reversible. The land could be returned to food production at a later date. The material that I'm suggesting is Macamphus or elephant grass. You can harvest it every year and it will regrow without replanting. It really is perfect for biomass. A really intense form of energy is tidal power, and we can harness this with underwater tidal turbines. Stop building these concrete barrages, that's 1950s technology. This technology is very much like the wind turbines. It works very well indeed, and it doesn't give you the environmental problems that you get with concrete barrages. We've got two really intense sources available in the UK, the Pentland Firth up in northeast Scotland and the Severn Estuary between the West Country and Wales. If we harnessed both of these, we could produce a very substantial amount of our electricity consumption. The problem being that the tides occur at certain times of day, which aren't always when we need the electricity. And we do need a form of electricity storage if we're to make full use of tidal. And unfortunately, that technology is not yet available. A less intense, but much more constant form of energy is wave power. This photograph shows an image of Salter's duck. This is actually a 1970s technology, and the Salter's duck remains the most efficient wave power converter. It absorbs about 90% of the energy coming in through the waves and leaves calm water behind it. In 1992, the Conservative government led by Margaret Thatcher closed down the wave energy project. Professor Salter claims that this was due to influence by the nuclear industry lobby. He was probably correct. The technology has never been revived commercially, which is a crying shame. We really do need to get this technology commercialized and in use. And it could be done in a fairly short time frame. This is my favorite of all, the organic Rankine cycle, ORC geothermal concept. We already have a geothermal station in this country in Southampton. We draw heat from 1.8 kilometers below ground from the borehole. It taps into the Wessex aquifer. And it produces heat at 76 degrees centigrade. At the moment, that's just used in a district heating network, but that temperature is hot enough to use in an organic Rankine cycle generator to produce electricity. The only other hot spring which you may know about is the hot springs in Bath. But they only produce water at 45 degrees centigrade, which isn't hot enough for the technology currently. I've done some work on this, and we could adapt the technology so that it would work at 45 degrees for the water available in Bath. There are also geothermal sources available in Cornwall and in Scotland. This is a resource which could be developed, and we could start tomorrow. At present, absolutely nothing's happening on this one. Oh, my seems to have frozen up. Oh God, no, I didn't mean that. Apologies. Right, this is what I wanted to get to. Once we have decarbonised electricity, we have to use the electricity as efficiently as possible. When it comes to heating our buildings, the most efficient way of doing this would be by district heating heat pumps. This example was built in a factory in Scotland by a company called Star Refrigeration, and it is the only district heating heat pump in the United Kingdom which uses an environmentally friendly refrigerant, ammonia. But this technology is available and it could be rolled out tomorrow. This is a list of 39 cities where we could use geothermal heat pumps using the rivers that run through the areas. Very simple, very cost effective. And again, we could start that work tomorrow. In addition, we've got 10 sites where the urban centres are on estuaries or in coastal locations where we can use the seawater or estuary water as the heat source. Another 10 major locations where geothermal heat pumps would be cost effective. And in the areas where it's not appropriate to use district heating, rural areas and in smaller communities, we would simply use decentralized heat pumps for individual buildings. There's already a huge range of products available on the market. The one that I'm showing you now is manufactured in Austria, and it produces 6.7 kilowatts of heat for every kilowatt of electricity that you pay for, making it the most efficient heat pump available. That's twice as efficient as the standard air source heat pumps. Not only that, it uses environmentally friendly refrigerants which do not cause global warming. So that is a very brief overview of what we can do. Decarbonising power consumption and buildings is absolutely critical, and we do need to start tomorrow. So thank you ever so much for listening, and I'd like to hand back to Lucy to introduce the next speaker. Thank you.
Great, thanks Nick. So I will be discussing gross domestic product. So GDP, as you probably will know, is a measure of economic development, and this measurement includes the variables private consumption, gross investment, government spending, and exports minus imports. So GDP, as I'm sure you guys are quite familiar with, is the most frequently and widely used measure of development internationally. And because you can quantify each country's development, you can then rank them, which is exactly what the International Monetary Fund does every single year. So they calculate the GDPs and they rank them top 10 countries with the highest GDP. So you'd think these top 10 countries, they're the wealthiest, they're the most developed, considered with this measurement, they should be the epitome of what civilization should be, right? Well, that's if GDP is the best measure. And hopefully I can try and evidence to you that GDP really is not the best measure we should be taking forward in terms of development and how our country is doing. And I could talk about this for ages, but very limited time, so I'm only going to use 4 examples to illustrate this. So the first topic I'd like to talk about is overconsumption. And hopefully you won't be surprised in which the country I use to example this is America. So America ranks number 1 in terms of GDP on this IMF list with $21 trillion per year. And in terms of food overconsumption, so guidelines are 2,500 calories a day for men to maintain the same weight, whereas the average American citizen consumes more than 3,600 calories a day. And it's therefore as a result of this that 70 million adults are classed as obese, which is 40% of American population. And the figures are similar for children and adolescents, which is quite shocking. And one would really like to reflect on what hole it is that food is filling to satisfy these people's needs if the wealth that their country has is not. And subsequently, due to this pandemic, is that 250,000 surgeries were performed due to obesity-related illnesses. And we really need to think about the quality of life for these people pre and post-surgery. You know, we need to think about how invasive an operation is to your autonomy, the physical discomfort from rehabilitation from the surgery, recovery time off work, which will affect your income and the economy as a whole, and your ability to not move freely when you're contained in a hospital. You can't participate in society, you can't see loved ones. So clearly, high GDP in America sounds great, but it's actually not serving people there. It's not improving their quality of life. You also need to think about, you know, overconsumption of material goods. And if you think about home storage units, is a massive industry in America, which is quite shocking considering, you know, their size of houses. And we only need to see a few videos of shopping centres on Black Friday to know that something really has gone wrong with humanity. Secondly, in terms of civil liberties, I'd like to discuss. So Japan ranks third on the GDP list with $5 trillion a year. But same-sex marriages held abroad were not recognised only until 2009. That's so recent in terms of global history. Furthermore, same-sex couples are not allowed to marry. They're only allowed to issue partnership certificates, which sounds great, but it's only Pacific cities, and these certificates allow hospital visitations and the capacity to rent an apartment together, and that's it. Also, same-sex couples are not allowed to adopt. Female couples are not permitted IVF or artificial insemination. So you could say, amazing, you know, their GDP is doing really well. The manufacturing, technological, and car industries are producing, but on an individual level, people do not have freedom, you know, freedom of choice, liberty in and of themselves. The third topic I'd like to discuss is physical health. So as Joe mentioned so brilliantly before, India is what I'd like to discuss for this topic. India ranks 5th in terms of GDP worldwide. And so PM are particles that are produced through combustion. And the World Health Organization says that 10 micrograms per cubic meter is what's the upper boundary of what's considered safe. India is ranked one of the most polluted countries in the world, with an average PM of 73, so over 7 times what is considered safe for humans. As a result of this, 82,000 people died from asthma in 2015 in India. So on one side, amazing, the garment industry is doing well and India has a high volume of exports, but individually their citizens can't breathe. But that's not reflected in GDP. And in terms of mental health, Canada is ranked 10th according to the IMF in terms of its GDP, whereas 16% of Canada's population has a mental health or substance abuse disorder, which includes depression, anxiety, eating disorder, alcohol or drug misuse, and schizophrenia. And when I was doing this research, I thought, okay, 16% doesn't actually sound that bad. And then I did more research and I compared that on a global perspective. So it actually ranks between Tunisia, which has a political crisis, and Yemen, which had a civil war in 2015 and is still facing repercussions of that. And it's directly equivalent to Greece, which recently had a debt crisis. So while 16% doesn't sound too bad, when you compare it globally, that's pretty shocking for a country that's considered to be extremely wealthy. So to summate, production and consumption should not be the key factors when we measure development, progress, or success of a country. I do have suggestions for alternatives that I'll cover later in the Q&A section. We need to think about, we are the most medicated, depressed, and abused generation in history. We need to ask ourselves, what are we prepared to give up in this pursuit of higher GDP? Our health, our freedom, our democracy? Or should we measure our lives in a different way that encompasses a full breadth of human experience instead of just forcing ourselves to produce more? So I'll leave you with this quote by Alice Obamsawin. When the last tree is cut down, the last fish eaten, and the last stream poisoned, you will realize that you cannot eat money. Ros, would you like to continue the next part?
Thanks. Thank you, Lucy. I'm just going to share my screen. Minimize that. Right, thank you. Okay, I'm going to talk about biodiversity. So biodiversity is the name that we give to all life on Earth, from bacteria to buffalo, from hawthorns to humans. All living things exist within an ecosystem, whether that is an ocean, a forest, a meadowland, or a city. Humans rely on this biodiversity to survive. We are connected to one big natural system and each element supports the other. We need fresh water, clean air, food, and protection from viruses. We need forests to take carbon from the air and peatlands to prevent flooding. Just having nature around us is not enough. We need a natural world that is complex, resilient, and thriving. We need biodiversity. Currently, more than 30,000 species are listed as threatened with extinction, which is 27% of all assessed species. Researchers agree that 5 mass extinction events have already happened, including the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. Many scientists agree that we are now living through a 6th mass extinction. And I'm afraid that humans are to blame for this through overexploitation of resources and the impact that we're having on the climate. The UK ranks 198 out of 218 nations for nature lost, meaning that we are amongst the most nature depleted countries in the world. We have lost habitats such as ponds and hedgerows, wetlands and upland bogs, fens and grasslands. In the UK, we have all but abandoned traditional mixed farming methods. Worldwide, 45% of land is taken up by animal agriculture. That is either livestock or intensively grown crops to feed them. 91% of the destruction of the Amazon is to make way for cattle grazing or animal feed crops. Every day, the world's 1.5 billion cows use a staggering amount of resources that could be used to feed the 1 billion people who are starving daily. Methane emissions from livestock are a major contributor to greenhouse gases and so to climate change, contributing more than the world's transport sector combined. Humans and livestock now make up 96% of all biomass, with free-living animals accounting for only 4%. Habitat loss is a major cause of biodiversity loss. And this intensive farming destroys our soil. Back in the UK, Michael Gove has warned that we are 30 to 40 years away from the fundamental eradication of soil fertility. That is, we have only 30 to 40 harvests left. Insecticides destroy our pollinating insects. Artificial fertilisers poison our waterways. In the UK, we've lost coastal habitats due to sea level rise, and increases in sea temperatures have affected the marine food webs. In the world's oceans, 3/4 of the world's fishing areas are now severely depleted. 28 billion marine animals are pulled out of the ocean every year, and for every 1 kilogram of fish, there is 10 kilograms of bykill, such as dolphins, whales, sharks, and turtles. Scientists estimate that we will have fishless oceans by 2048. But what could a positive future be like? What if in the UK we undertook huge rewilding projects, allowed for the natural regeneration of forests, reclaimed our peatlands, wetlands, and coastal habitats? What if there were biodiversity-rich wildlife corridors between all farmed land? What if we created more food security and encouraged biodiversity by growing our own fruit and vegetables, maybe as part of community projects or on local small holdings, creating green jobs and revitalising our rural communities? So what can we do right now as individuals? Our diet has a huge impact on biodiversity loss. Researchers state that a sustainable level of consumption is more than 50 grams per week of meat, fish, and dairy combined. Could you start with Meat-Free Monday and gradually increase that? Could you contemplate becoming vegetarian or vegan? No other lifestyle choice has a more profoundly positive impact on all life on Earth than moving towards a plant-based diet. So what else can we do? Very importantly, you can take action with local groups to help create systemic change. We can buy local produce that supports food grown in a sustainable and biodiverse way. Look out for community-supported and regenerative agriculture. Are there food growing schemes near you? Could you start one with neighbours or friends? This positive future is possible. We can halt biodiversity loss if we act now, and we act together. Thank you. I'd now like to hand over to Kate.
Thanks, Roz. I'm going to talk briefly about the importance of climate justice. By climate justice, we mean the aim to achieve some chance of a safe climate for future generations, an equal distribution of the remaining global carbon budget between countries, and a transition in the UK in which the costs are distributed progressively and where everyone's essential needs for housing, transport and energy use are met. Clearly, there are many approaches that can be taken to solve the climate crisis, particularly if justice isn't your main concern. Wealthy countries and wealthy individuals are able to, and do, mitigate the effects of climate change in ways that aren't possible for much of the world. Carbon reduction policies, if applied equally across all regions and nations, could have the effect of exacerbating inequality and failing to recognise the benefits that more developed regions have already had from their greater carbon use. So how do we ensure that the positive steps we take are for the benefit of all of humanity and don't just serve to protect the privileged few? The recent swell of interest and support for the Black Lives Matter movement has brought the ongoing struggle for racial justice into the spotlight, even in countries which don't perceive themselves as inherently racist. As the killing of George Floyd highlighted the pervasive issue of racism in the police force, so the disproportionate number of BAME individuals dying from COVID-19 highlighted how health outcomes are so closely intertwined with socioeconomic conditions. When considering solutions to racial justice, we must also consider solutions to social and economic justice. The same is true for climate justice. It cannot be achieved unless we focus on the wider social and economic outcomes as well. When I first started to consider climate justice, I saw this as a global problem. How do we ensure that the poorest countries, and in particular the global south, do not suffer twice? Firstly, due to climate change itself, and secondly, due to the impact of global policy decisions to lower or minimise carbon use. But it is a question that is just as valid nationally. How do we ensure that the poorest people in our society are not penalised the highest by environmental policies? In the US, your race is the single biggest factor that determines whether you live near a hazardous waste facility. In the UK, more deprived areas are statistically more likely to have worse air pollution levels than affluent areas. In Manchester in 2015, Black children made up 30% of hospital admissions for asthma, despite only making up 10% of the population. So what can we do to redress the balance? Here are 5 positive steps you can take. 1. Write to your MP to ensure that there is continued pressure on the government to deliver its full commitment of international climate finance, which is intended to go to clean growth, reducing carbon emissions, and helping the poorest countries manage the impacts of climate change. There has been some noise that this will be redirected to middle-income countries because this might better further British interests. We need to push back on this. If you don't think writing to your MP will have much effect, I hear there is a rebellion around the corner. 2. If you are donating money, then look at supporting some of the amazing campaigns that Indigenous communities are running around the world. 3. Regularly check the planning pipeline for your area, not just for residential buildings, but also for new industrial and infrastructure projects. Consider whether these are likely to cause pollution for existing residents, and if so, write to your council. You will be able to find planning permission applications online, and anyone can file an objection which must be taken into account. 4. Consider mobilising within your community, both politically and economically. Projects which are run by big corporations or centralised governments often fail to take into account the interests of the poorest or minority groups. Solutions such as citizen engagement in owning and producing renewable energy, cooperatives and worker-owned businesses, community land trusts, and community development financial institutions need to play an increasingly central role. These are a way of challenging our current dominant, extractive and unsustainable model of corporate capitalism. And finally, log on to climatejust.org.uk, which has fantastic information about climate justice in the UK, including detailed analysis of the effects of the UK's climate and energy policy on the most deprived groups. It also has some great information on what people need to do to help. I want to end on a note of hope. The Dakota Access Pipeline is a 1,172-mile-long underground oil pipeline in the United States. Since it was announced in 2014, it has been the subject of continued protest for environmental reasons, and because much of the pipeline runs through land which is sacred to Indigenous nations. The pipeline was completed in 2017. But last month, the US District Court for Washington, DC, ordered the pipeline to be shut down, following an action brought by the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. The court ruled that an important federal permit granted to the pipeline's developer energy transfer partners was in violation of the National Environmental Policy Act. As a result, the permit must be scrapped, and the pipeline was forced to cease operations and be emptied of oil within a month. This is a prime example of why we need a variety of protest methods and tools at our disposal. The protests have included civil disobedience, interaction with politicians including Barack Obama and Bernie Sanders, as well as legal claims. The hope is that this case will pave the way for the success of future campaigns across the US. By fighting on all fronts and by their refusal to give up, the protesters were ultimately successful. It's now time for us all to do the same. I'll now hand back to Roz to run us through a visualisation of the future.
Thanks, Kate. That was fantastic. Right, so if you feel comfortable to, then please close your eyes, or if not, then just cast your eyes downwards. I want you to imagine this. This morning, Boris Johnson woke up, looked into the eyes of his newborn son, and made a decision. Enough is enough. We need rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. And so his government and other international governments consulted the people, took action, and the world changed. Now there is a door in front of you, and on the other side of that door, it is July 22nd, some years in the future. You walk up to that door, you turn the handle, and you step through with all of your senses. What can you see, feel, hear, and smell? Have a really good look around you and just take some time to take it all in. Now step back through the door into 2020 and open your eyes. What was it that struck you most about this future? Was there something that really inspired you to make changes today? We need to think radically about our future. If we can collectively imagine the future that we want, then it can happen. This talk is a passionate call to action, and together there is no end to what we can accomplish. Thank you. We'd like to, the talk has gone on for slightly longer than we thought. People are therefore very welcome to leave because we said 7:45, but if people would like to stay, we can keep the call open until 8, and we're very happy to take questions. If anybody with a question would like to raise their hand, and if you feel like you're not getting any attention from us because we can't see everybody, then please just pop a question in the chat. So I'll hand the floor over to you, anybody who has any questions.
Can I speak? I had my hand up.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I think it's great. The huge amount of effort has gone into this presentation. There are one or two things that concern me. Just having read quite an interesting article in Permaculture Works entitled, "Should We Be Supporting a Green New Deal?" And I'll try and find the link and stick it in the chat. But, you know, one of the key things is this emphasis on renewable energy. And we didn't mention, or it wasn't mentioned, that we need a huge decrease in energy consumption. And that it was no way that renewables, even with all the technology, is going to enable us to carry on using energy at the rate that we are at the moment. And this article is making it very clear that if we just push for more electric cars and more of the minerals and whatnot that we need to build PV solar panels, the dynamos for the wind turbines and probably the tidal ones as well, it's devastating parts of the third world because these rare metals are not easy to get out, and there are many communities that have been absolutely devastated by it. So I think we should really be concentrating far more on not business as usual in terms of consuming energy, but very much how we can reduce energy consumption, which isn't to say that we don't need renewables, but the emphasis, I think, should be far more on reduction of energy use. And so even miscanthus grass, for instance, it's going to remove land from food growing, and it's also going to remove land from rewilding. And rewilding is absolutely vital for biodiversity. Yeah, so that was a couple of the points. I mean, I could go on, but I don't want to hog the airwaves.
Yeah, I think they're very excellent points, David. Thank you. I don't know, Nick, have you got any other comments?
I would agree entirely, and with a little bit longer, I would have put in a section on energy conservation. But thanks for raising those points.
Yeah, excellent point. Any other questions at all? Hi, Lucy.
Do you mind if I jump in as well with that, Nick? Thanks, David. I agree with you. And like from my point of view, we live in such a consumerist society, but the economy is demand driven. So if we reduce demand or if we change the way demand is, the companies will have to abide by where the demand is. So they'll be producing things that are last longer, that are more sustainable, that are less pollutive. And I agree with you that we actually completely need to reduce the amount of energy we're requiring. And that will happen over time while our consumerist traditions are changing. We get more people on board. So I agree with you. And I think having GDP as like the world measure is only encouraging consumption and production, which is not where we need to be.
Thank you, Lucy. Do we have any other questions? Okay, I can't see any hands. So, oh, John.
Yeah, I'll just add my 3 penneth to that last one as well. I mean, certainly in terms of transport, I think it's perfectly clear that electric cars are an improvement on fossil fuel vehicles, but they are not the answer by any means. And I would just say that what we need is a decent, affordable, comfortable, reliable public transport service all across the country that is going to be usable. So yeah, and that's how you would reduce consumption in that area. Yeah.
Hi, Julie.
I would go so far as to say I would prefer to call for a free public transport system.
Definitely.
Even. Let's be ambitious in our visions. Seriously.
I agree.
That's what I want to call for.
Thanks, Julie. Tom?
It's not actually a question, but I just wanted to say thank you to all of you, because all of the talks tonight have been very positive in their outlook. And it's so often that we hear about all the bad things that are happening and the things that we need not to do. And it's just been really nice to listen to you guys set out what is where we could go and the positive view of where we could be. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. So if we have no more questions, then we'll let everybody go off to have some food.
I do have a question.
Go ahead.
I think Ross is frozen. Can I answer it? Can I ask it?
Go ahead.
It's been recorded, this talk, which has been really, really good. And I'm wondering, how does one access a recording of it, please?
Toby?
We'll put it on our YouTube, I think, and share it around.
Okay, thank you. So do you have your own YouTube channel?
Yeah, we've only got one talk up, which is the Heading for Extinction one that we did recently, but we'll plan to add more as we do them.
Great, thank you.
And I guess we'll try and inform you when that's up there.
Joe, did you have a point?
Yes, I have a wiggly finger. So just to say that in case you haven't seen it, if you look on the chat, you'll find some useful links that relate to various subjects and ways you can act. If you look at the chat, and you can save that. If you just go to the three little dots there, click on that, and just put save chat, and that'll save everything for you there, so you'll have all the links. Thank you.
Julie.
Hello, hi.
Hi.
Good evening, everybody. I just, more of a comment really, I suppose, and thank you ever so much for all of the presentations, really, really useful and very insightful. I work for Hertfordshire County Council, and I just want to put myself out to you to say that I am the new Head of Sustainability at Hertfordshire County Council, and I would really urge you to go and look at our sustainability strategy, which was approved at Cabinet in March. And we would very, very much like your views and your comments on our strategy. Now, our strategy was approved at Cabinet in 23rd of March, and because of COVID-19, we couldn't then do anything in terms of publication, consultation, anything at all about our strategy. And I was in post from the 1st of April, and I've been trying to get people to see our strategy and to get involved in it, but it's been very, very difficult due to COVID-19. So I would very much like to have an open invitation to say, please go onto Hertfordshire County Council's website, have a look for the new sustainability pages, and email me at sustainablehearts.gov.uk. I am on holiday at the moment, so give me a week, and I would very, very much like to start a conversation with you, all of you, about what we can try and do in terms of Hertfordshire. I think it's really, really important that we really make things Hertfordshire specific, because people need to see things on their doorstep to be able to actually take action. If it needs to be important to them to be able to make that change and to change their behaviours. So I just an open invitation really. Sustainablehearts.gov.uk is the email address. We are working on some specific web pages at the moment, and we really, really hope that we will start getting some consultation and some engagement out there as soon as we can. But I'm sure you can appreciate that COVID-19 has completely consumed everybody in terms of Hertfordshire County Council. So we are trying to cope with COVID and trying to carry on with business as usual, including Sustainable Hertfordshire. So open invitation for people to contact me.
Thank you, Julie. I'm sure that you'll get. We will take you up on that in abundance.
Absolutely, and it might be that we need to have further conversations, and that's absolutely fine. Just opening that door.
Thank you, and Alex.
Thanks so much for coming, especially.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Alex, you had a question.
No, it's okay. I put it in the chat, and I think someone's already answered it. You're going to email the link out so we can put it back. You know, when we tweeted about it and put it on Facebook, so it'd be good to be able to share the video as well.
Thanks, Alex. Yes.
Thanks,
Julie.
I have a question for Julie. Thank you so much for being here, Julie. The Widen My Path website that was mentioned earlier. I wonder if you could point that to your highways department.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've got it written down. I wrote it down, and I even put an exclamation mark saying HCC has been asked to look at this. So I've written that down, and I will pass it on.
Excellent. Yep. Thank you very much.
Fabulous. I'm sure we'll be in touch. Okay, so I think that's all the questions. Thank you ever so much for coming.